Welcome to ANN In Depth, the podcast that explains to you how the Adventist Church works and most of the time why we do what we do. In today's episode, we'll talk about global mission. There are over 7,500 people groups in the world who never heard of Jesus. You may have been excited that, we are in 215 countries. That's almost every country in the world. Yeah, country is not the best measure. The best measure is people groups and languages. And there is a long way to go for us to fulfill this mission. And today we have Rick Kajiura, who leads the communication efforts of Adventist Mission, a ministry office dedicated to reaching those 7.5 thousand or 7,500 people groups. Rick, welcome to ANN In Depth.
Thank you, Sam. It's good to be here.
So you work in the communication department of Adventist Mission. What is Adventist Mission? Is it an office? Is it a department? Is it a ministry? What is it?
So Adventist Mission is an office, and it has two primary responsibilities. One is global mission, and one is mission awareness. And the global mission started in 1990 when they looked at the whole world. It was Elder Wilson Sr. who looked at the entire world with his team and said, what are we doing? Where are we not reaching people? And what can we do? And out of that was sort of a mission initiative to focus on the unreached areas of the world. And in those times, it was groups of 1 million or more that are unreached. A lot of people default to countries, so we still talk about that somewhat because it's easy to understand. But people groups are where we're really trying to focus.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about one of those emphases that you mentioned, which is the global mission, reaching these very hard to reach people groups. And you serve Adventist Mission in communication.
Yes.
Right? So presumably you help each of these, of the different parts of Adventist Mission to communicate that message with the world. What are these parts? You have the global centers. What else? Tell me more about all that.
Well, one of the things is communicating the challenge of the unreached. Who are these? How do we reach them? What are we trying to do to reach them? What is successful? And part of that is raising funds specifically for for projects specifically aimed at planting new groups of believers among unreached people groups. And one of the ways we do that is sending out Global Mission Pioneers. So we share those stories about what Global Mission Pioneers are doing, sometimes the challenges they face, but sometimes what's happening, how small groups are starting. And one of the challenges we have is some of those unreached people groups are in highly sensitive areas. So how do you tell those stories? For many years we said, some of the best stories we can't share. How do we do that? So there's always that sort of tightrope we're walking of how much do you share, and especially now that things are all on the internet.
What is a Global Mission Pioneer?
So Global Mission Pioneer is a church planter. We usually send them out 2 by 2, much like the apostles went out. And they are sent into an area or, to work among a people group where there are no or very few Adventists. And their goal is to work among the people, establish relationships using Christ's method of, mingling with people and then ending up with bidding them to follow Jesus. And so they go in there and they'll establish relationships, but their end goal is to start a new group of believers in that people group.
So if there is an island in the Pacific with a tribe that lives remotely and there's no Adventist presence, we may have a Global Mission Pioneer spend a good part of their lives there, learning the language and trying to plant a church there.
Right. And so in the early days of Global Mission, that happened quite a bit. We focused on islands and remote villages. More and more, we're focusing on what the church is calling Mission Refocus, the 3 windows, which are the Urban Challenge, the 1040 Window Challenge, which is, what Global Mission has long focused on, and the Post-Christian Challenge. So now we're looking at how do we send pioneers, church planters, into these areas and start new groups of believers.
I see. However way you cut it, our challenge is pretty big.
It's huge. It's a really big challenge. The 1040 window alone is a huge challenge, but you add in those other two. The urban population of Earth has shifted, whereas before most people lived in rural areas, I don't know, quite a few years ago now, the population shifted to being a more urban population. And that in and of itself brings challenges. I remember I was driving through, we were doing some meetings in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and we're driving to the main church in the city. And we had a church planting teacher, instructor there with us. And as we were driving through, we were about 2 blocks away from the large church there. And we were passing through a neighborhood that was a very poor neighborhood. And he said, "Is there a church in that neighborhood?" And they said, "No, there's not." He said, "Would they come to that big wealthy church over here?" He said, "No, they'd probably never think of it." He said, "We need to plant a church there." And so that shows the importance when you're looking at a huge urban area of not looking at one city and saying, "We have a church, we're done." I remember going into one of the largest cities in India as well, and there's a church there that's been there over 100 years, but they haven't planted many more churches, in that area. Now they're working on that, so now they've got, quite a few small groups. And the fun thing about these small groups is they often grow into churches. I grew up in Canada. I went to an Adventist church. It's on a hill in this city. And this one pastor came. He was Sri Lankan, and he had this vision for church planting. And so, by the way, he was also the person, if any of the listeners have heard the little yellow truck story from Eric B. Hare, he was the one driving that truck.
Okay.
Some people may not know, but if you Google it, find it online.
He was that guy.
He was that guy. But anyway, he had that vision for church planting. And so he looked at another part of the city and said, we've got a lot of members over there and they come all this way. Why don't we start a small group over there? And so he did. And then in the next city over, he started another small group. And, I've been back there recently. During his time there, he planted, 1, 2, 3, at least 4 groups of believers that are all full-size churches today. So.
Okay. Now, your team produces a lot of stories. They travel the world. They find where the gospel has had, the everlasting gospel, a tremendous impact in people's lives. Often they became Seventh-day Adventist missionaries as a consequence of the transformation that happened in their lives. Mm-hmm. And you tell those inspiring stories.
Right.
What do you think it's like for your team to meet face-to-face all of these tremendous faith and miraculous stories?
I have said, that I have the best job in the church, and you do to a certain extent too, because we do get to talk with those people who are mingling with people, who are having to rely on God and the Holy Spirit to accomplish what they're accomplishing. There's nothing like increasing your faith than when you are in an area where there are, few or no Adventists, and then to realize it's just you and maybe one other partner, and, you've got this huge challenge. I mean, can you imagine, what Paul must have felt like, too, going out into the various cities that he went to, and yet he started all these churches. I was in another country recently, and about 30 years ago, Global Mission funded a pioneer to go into this one area. There were no Adventists in this area, and so he went in there with the idea of starting a church or a group. And when he got there, he met resistance from the city. So he sort of moved out and tried to work in these villages nearby, and he managed to start new groups. But by then he'd been there longer, he was making friends in the city, and then he discovered that an Adventist family had moved in there, one Adventist family. So they connected. Somehow, when people understand your beliefs, they realize, hey, you're like this other person.
You are as strange as they are.
You're as strange as they are. And so they said, you should go talk to so-and-so. And so they connected. And then they started a church in that city. So recently I went back. I heard about this. I said, I want to go back and see what's happened today. And so there's a church in that city today. And, it's a full church building. They have a school right next door.
Oh, wow.
I went out to those villages, and both of them have full-size churches. Now, the one, mind you, is still, growing, but it has also started a second, what they call baby churches.
Oh, wow.
They also have a school, and that school, it's a very rudimentary school. It's corrugated sheet metal classrooms and things like that, but they have a small school there. And I think they said each one of them has started several small groups themselves already. So it shows that sort of growth over time, when you plant a group of believers. Now, when you plant a group of believers, how do you get people to come in? And that's one of the things that we at Global Mission do as well, is we try to show the variety of ways that pioneers are doing that first step of Christ's method of ministry, which is mingling. And so, some of them are distributing literature, some of them open small centers, health centers or things like that, where they can meet with people, massage centers. Some today are using digital evangelism to reach out, to connect with people, and then, finding people who have an interest and then connecting them with the church.
Especially in those urban areas where people have closed their doors to visitors and anyone coming to them.
Right.
But they proceed to search for the same things they have always needed, because they're humans, on their screens. And if we can connect with them through their screens, they will open their houses, homes. They will come to ours as we open our homes and churches to them. And most importantly, they'll open their hearts for the gospel. We've seen this everywhere.
Right, yeah. And, that connection online, if it becomes a real connection, I think it's stronger.
Yes.
I think it can happen both ways. I think one thing that people don't always understand when they hear, we're trying different ways of reaching people, they say, wait a second, isn't that wrong? We're not talking about the message changing. We're talking about that first step of mingling, meeting needs, sympathizing.
Yes.
And those are the ways that we need to find different ways.
Yes.
One of the ways that in one country was they started this soccer program for children. And, they were playing soccer. They had the equipment. They had people come in. And I've had people say, I don't want my money, that's supposed to be going for mission for a soccer program, a sports program. But what they're not realizing is this is in a country where people very seldom interact with Christians. Here we have all these young children going, their parents are coming, they're getting to know people, they're getting to know Christians maybe for the first time. And that opens those doors to begin, not necessarily forceful witnessing, but more living a life that people begin to ask questions and say, you're different, or, why do you do this? And that begins to open doors of understanding that can lead to people coming to faith and then starting those groups.
Yes, I've seen both of those successful, Rick. I've seen those projects where when the doors are open, the missionaries, let's call them, even if they are in their own local church, they take the opportunity for the second part of Christ's method, and they openly share what they believe.
Right, yeah.
Because the window is open, the opportunity is open. But I've also seen where missionaries are so worried and scared, they never enter that door. The door is open multiple times, but they're always, because they don't want to lose their friendship.
Right.
And there is always the possibility that when you mention Jesus, doors may be closed. And this was the same in the first century, the second, and every century until now. So it is always a temptation. There are two temptations. One, not building relationships and just, bringing Jesus up when people are not ready.
Yeah.
And the second temptation is maintaining the friendship and never bringing Jesus into the equation. So those are the temptations, I guess, that we need to avoid, both in all the windows, especially that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think we have to realize that we can, live our lives, be that witness, look for opportunities, but the Holy Spirit plays a very important role
Yes.
of convicting those hearts. And I think we need to be open to that prompting to know when the time is right.
Yes.
I think for some people, maybe it's never right. There's a verse in the Bible that says, shake the dust from your feet and move on.
But even in that case, in Luke 10, where that is mentioned, they had brought Jesus up. They brought the kingdom, and they were rejected.
They did,
So,
yeah.
it's leaving a place without ever
Well, you're right, yes.
coming to that. I
Yeah.
don't think it's good either.
No.
I
And Global Mission Pioneers are specifically sent into that area.
To do that.
To do that.
Exactly.
So they have that role. There's another program where students go into to study in different countries where we can't send missionaries, and their role is, to study, but to witness. And we interviewed one of those one time, and we said, which is more important, your studies or your witness? And they said, my witness. So I think sometimes that intentionality of going in with that specific purpose can change that mindset. You can lose friendships over that.
Yes. Let me give you an odd view that I have. It's not that odd, but there are places in the world where it's illegal to be an Adventist, where it's
Yes.
illegal to bring up Jesus, where it's illegal to bring a Bible into the country.
Mm-hmm.
And we wonder how it would be possible one day to fulfill our mission of proclaiming the everlasting gospel, however that is done.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we mention the word proclamation, people think of evangelistic meetings and so on. That's just one form of proclamation.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And it is not the most powerful. The most powerful is the one-on-one around the kitchen table sharing what you believe. And it seems impossible today. I've talked to some missionaries who have real fears for their lives in the place where they are, with good reason.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But then we also have history that says it may be impossible today. Try and preach in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in 1985, for example.
Right.
And you would think this is impossible. It's the Iron Curtain.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed Vyacheslav, who had his Bible confiscated. They had to enter a wardrobe in their homes and cover themselves with blankets, so the typewriter where they were typing portions of the Bible and the Spirit of Prophecy
Mm-hmm.
to give to others could not be heard by the neighbors, otherwise they would be in trouble with the police.
And the baptisms where they chopped a hole in the ice out in the country
Yeah,
where nobody
exactly.
could see, and then did their baptisms there. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's 1985.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have thought that in 5 years, the doors would be open and the gospel would be proclaimed so powerfully in the same place that was so closed before? Mm-hmm. I think some of these pioneers, some of these brave missionaries who are working in those territories and sometimes work for 10 years and they don't see a single fruit, but they've learned the language, they learned the culture, they learned. Mm-hmm. God is just preparing us for when those doors open for us to be ready.
Yes.
Do you know anything about the plans that South Korea has for when North Korea opens? Have you heard about that?
I know they have plans, and I know they've designated one specific person to try to make those plans and plan ahead so they are prepared. And I think you gave the example of the former Soviet Union, and I think nobody thought it was going to happen, and definitely not as quickly as it did. We mobilized fairly quickly, but how much more could we have done, if we had been thinking ahead, which, they're thinking about in South Korea and other areas as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, Rick, before we end this episode, what else can you tell me about Global Mission? Let's talk about the mission centers, because I think they're part of
Yes.
Global Mission. What are them? What are the mission centers?
So we have 6 global mission centers that focus specifically on certain people groups. Some of those are sort of religiously centered, partly understanding, building bridges, helping to understand their culture, their mindset, because sometimes it can be very different. So we have a Center for Adventist Muslim Relations, a Center for Adventist Jewish Relations. We have one for Buddhist relations or Southeast Asian, one for South Asian, Hindu and other religions. And then we also have a secular and post-Christian, and one for urban. Did I hit all six?
Yeah,
I
you
lost
did.
track.
Very well done.
But, yeah. So, but part of what they do is they visit different areas and see what's happening, see what's working. They then train people. So the Post-Christian Center, that's one of the more recent challenges, I think, that most people aren't as familiar with. But they are doing what they call cohort training, where they bring groups of people together, and then they work on training, sharing what has been working in other places, what is working. Then they go out and I think they regather and they share experiences. So they're learning about what they can do, that is working. And again, this is not changing the message, but changing that way of those first interactions of people who, and they're called post-Christian because many of them are familiar with Christianity. We go into some areas of the world, they know very little about Christianity, or their perceptions are very skewed and biased. In these areas, people have, they're in countries that have come out of Christianity, and the number of Christians has declined drastically. And as somebody said, a lot of times it's that way because their picture of Christ or their understanding of Christ is not right. And I think that's very true. But bringing them back into that relationship, in those areas, if you go in first and say, I want to tell you about Christ, I want to tell you about Jesus, you're going to get this reaction of, no thanks. I've done that, been there, done that, I'm out. But if you start with those relationships and let them see how Jesus works in your life, then that is the way that it makes a difference. So
Yes, which has been the case for the last 2,000 years.
in every culture and group, yeah.
If somebody wants to become a global mission pioneer or a tent maker, which is a self-funded missionary, or they want to go into mission, where should they go?
Well, first of all, you did ask me what global mission pioneers are, and I partially answered. But global mission pioneers are usually people who are from the culture or familiar with the culture because they're close to the culture.
Oh, I
and
see.
so they go in and live and work among people that they may already know the language, they may have a background with that particular people group.
Okay.
So then we have, missionaries or tent makers and things like that who come from another culture and go in there.
I see.
They can find out, one of the ways they can do that is visit vividfaith.com, which is sort of a platform of connecting people with mission opportunities.
Vividfaith.com.
Yes,
Did you write that down?
vividfaith.com.
Vividfaith.com. Go ahead and find out for yourself what mission opportunities you can find there. Okay, so vividfaith.com, that's the place to go.
Yeah, and that's great for when you're looking for opportunities anywhere. Global mission pioneers are often recruited in the local areas or close to the local areas because they are people who are already from or familiar with that culture. So most of those, come from the area. Global mission does not sit over here in the U.S. and say, okay, here's where you're going to try to plant a church. Here's the people group you're going to try to work with, and here's the person you need to send. We are working with the local field saying, what areas, are you needing to reach? Who do you have who can do that? How much funding do you need? And then they can put a request in for funding that. And we don't send all the money. They have to put some money in. Every level of the church has to contribute some bit of that money so that they're doing projects that they really believe in.
Excellent. Okay, Rick, thank you for talking to us at A&N in depth about global mission. There's a lot more to cover. AdventistMission.org, I think, is your main website, correct?
It is, yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for listening to ANN In Depth. If you want to find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. And as we mentioned before, if you're looking for opportunities to serve today, then go to vividfaith.com. Thank you for listening to ANN In Depth. We hope to be here again next week.